If you want your story to stick, to be memorable, to engage people's full attention, you've got to say or do something that surprises people, that catches them off guard. In other words, confuse them or lose them. I know that sounds counterintuitive, confuse them or lose them. But how many times has someone bored you to death by giving a well thought out, but completely predictable presentation? Welcome to the Storytelling That Sticks for Business and Life 20-minute podcast. I'm your host and story coach, Doug Stevenson. In this podcast series, I'm going to share with you practical storytelling hacks, techniques, and holistic approaches that will make your stories stick. Stories that sell you and your product or service. Now, if you feel that you learned something valuable today, please click on the follow or subscribe button. In this episode, I interview Paul Butler, the owner of New Leaf Training and Development, an international staff training and consulting firm. Paul and I met in London when I gave a presentation way back in 2005. And as you'll hear in this interview, his memory of that presentation is very vivid, and it's a good example of what sticks. All right, let's get started.
I was reflecting on your book this morning, and I was just getting my head back into a few things. And you and I first met at a PSA meeting in London, and I was over there with Leslie Everett, who has that brand Walking Tall, and that was in September 2005.
2005. My goodness. 16 years ago.
Yes. Yeah. I think I had a mullet.
And I had more hair and no beard. 2005. Here we are talking in 2022. What do you remember from that meeting? What sticks?
I just remember you seem to have a real humble confidence about you. And I don't know whether it's because obviously I was surrounded by a bunch of Brits and you got this cool American accent. And I was like, I want to be in America. I need to speak to this gentleman. The other thing I remember as well, the two things that really, well, actually three things that stood out to me. Number one, I remember you had those visuals up on the stage, like posters.
The posters around the wall.
In very bright colors, and I'd never seen that before, and I thought it was so beautifully simple. The second thing I remember, I know faith is a very personal thing, but I think you were the first person I'd heard reference God in your presentation, because you finished up with that Marianne Williamson quote, which I'd never heard before. I'd never heard anybody mention their faith, subtly and stylishly the way that you did. It wasn't pushy, but it was just very gentle. And that was very attractional to me. Professional
Speakers Association in London. Yes. It's always been special for me to speak to speakers. That's where story theater had its genesis, was speaking to other speakers and teaching them how to tell stories in the way that I told stories, which is to not just tell a story, but to also act out moments and scenes from the story, primary scenes that are dramatic or comedic or whatever, that will help it to be more engaging, because it's kind of like what you're watching a movie. When we watch a movie, we get all triggered. And so I brought that acting stuff into storytelling. Do you remember me doing any of that there, that stood out? It's like, wow, the way that this guy tells story is unlike anything I've seen before, especially for Brits.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. I remember feeling really drawn into the stories. And I remember specifically you sharing the one about putting the pill inside the peanut butter. And I think if I remember correctly as well, I also recall you mentioning the one about look for the limo. And I just felt really drawn into the story as if I could personally relate. Because again, an American in a room full of Brits, and there's obviously a natural style difference. I just remember you showing more emotion than I'd heard from an English speaker before. Growing up in England, I remember our schoolmasters would say, as a young Englishman, you only show your emotion to dogs, horses, and a good rose garden. And here was Doug pouring his heart out about a trial, a tribulation, and then relating it back to me, drawing me in, asking, how does this relate to me, and a kind of a call to action. I just thought it was beautiful.
Now, tell us a little bit about your business model and how now you've incorporated storytelling into your life, into your business.
Yes, certainly. So I own a company called New Leaf Training and Development. We're a staff training and leadership development company. And we've been in the United States now for just over 16 years. And we've served clients now in 28 states, China, India, Western Europe. And about 5 years ago, we opened up a second office in Florida. We've now got about 8 trainers that work for us, well, facilitators, coaches out of our office in Los Angeles, and about 4.5 out of the office in Florida. And Florida does all of our e-learning for us as well. In terms of your specific question about storytelling, all of the work that we do, one of the attributes I always look for within people that we hire, because I only do probably about 20% of the training delivery now. I really focus on running the business and growing the business.
Good for you.
One of the attributes I always look for is the ability for, whether it's a coach working one-to-one, whether it's obviously a keynote speaker, one-to-many, or whether it's one-to-few, being like a seminar setting, either on site or online. I always look for our trainers to be able to tell good stories, and for that story not to be about me, myself, and I, but to be about them, us, and we, and really use stories as a bridge to the content that they're trying to deliver. Because as you and I know, especially when you're working with pretty sophisticated clients that we work with, is they've heard the content, they understand the academics of something. And I can't remember whether you said this, but that phrase that the fastest way to the brain is through the heart.
Emotion is the fast lane to the brain.
Yes. And what I found is, regardless of level of seniority within an organization, that if you can make someone feel something, they're likely to think something. And if they think something, they're likely to do something differently.
Oh, well said. If they feel something, they're likely to think something. If they think something, they're likely to do something. And that's where I believe the craft of storytelling, ending with the phrase that pays, is so critical, because you just said that you remember me telling a story about hide the pill in the peanut butter and look for the limo. You popped out of your mouth my 2 phrase that pays, my 2 most powerful and relevant and memorable phrase that pays. And everywhere I go, when people talk to me, they say, oh yeah, that look for the limo thing. And it's scientific. It is an advertising jingle. It is a way to make sure that, yes, you tell a story that engages people, because I know you know how to do that and you get your people to do that. But if you tell a story that engages people, but they don't remember the point,
yes,
well, then what's the point?
Yes. Just on a personal note as well, Doug, you hopefully think you'd find this to be quite funny. My wife and I, we've been married now for 28 years.
Oh, same as Deborah and I.
One of our phrases that we use with all of the different journeys that we do and the different things that we run into is we say, look for the limo. Like even last week, something happened. I won't bore you with the details, but something happened. And my wife said, rather than saying, look on the bright side, or every cloud's got a silver lining, she said, let's just look for the limo, because there's obviously some purpose to this. And 5 minutes later, everything went 180.
If a story is done correctly, and I am very deliberate, and I think if there's anything that I'm hoping you took from me, it's the deliberateness, the strategicness of a story, not just, well, just tell a story. It's like, well, no, but it's got to be the right story. It makes the right point for the right audience. So how have you personally, you're still doing presentations, right?
Yes, I tend to only focus on one specific aspect of the 3 areas that we focus in on our business. So we essentially hang all of our programs, all of our services on 3 areas. Number one is the ability to manage yourself. So things like time management. Number two, the ability to lead others, such as emotional intelligence leadership, and then growing business acumen or building business acumen. So you may recall my background is actually finance. I'm actually a chartered accountant, like an international version of a CPA. And to your point that you've made so clearly in the past when speaking about technical people, I really realized very early on, like when I first met you, I was a regional finance director for about 60 Hilton hotels in Europe. And I realized very early on that the accountants, once I could trust them as bookkeepers in the hotels, my role was often about helping them be better leaders and better communicators of information. And so to answer your question, one of the areas that I specialize in, or really the only area in our business where I tend to do the training delivery, is on the business finance side. And a lot of my work is helping talented financial people be able to communicate information clearly, concisely, and for action.
Now, is there a story that you have found that really works well that you tell over and over again to different audiences and different groups?
There's a little one that I use, which I think has really resonated with people, which was a short story about
Tell the story. Tell me the story.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So
just like you tell it to an audience, pretend that you're talking to my audience here and you're telling that story to them.
Yes, yes, certainly. So you really want me to present 64 slides is exactly the words that I said to my boss. And he insisted that the best way to approach this challenge was for me to present 64 slides on the joys, and I do mean the joys, of return on capital employed. Now, before you doze off, you may recall that the word return is above the line. That essentially means net income. And what's below the line is capital employed. Now, stay with me, don't fall asleep. Capital employed, as you'll recall, is no more complicated than net assets minus net liabilities. But my boss wanted me to present 64 slides to the 48 hotels within our region over the course of about 2 months of presentations. And I prodded him, I challenged him, I respectfully encouraged him to consider that maybe there was a different way of doing this. And I said to him, his name was also Paul, I said, Paul, if I could get this down to 3 slides and a 5-minute presentation, and if I could get the same result, if not even better result, would that be a win for you? And he said, go for it. So I arranged for all of the managers from all of the regions to come in over the course of 2 days into London. And I specifically asked for this one location in the heart of London. And I did this presentation to the general managers. And I brought up on the slide, this first slide about return on capital employed. And rather than telling these intelligent general managers about what that calculation means, which you'll recall is what? Net income divided by net assets minus current liabilities. I actually drew that information out from the general managers. So within like a minute or two, they knew exactly what the calculation was. I then said to them, slide number 2, which one of those 2, fingers on the buzzers, 2 weeks vacation in Cancun, all expenses paid by my boss, which one of those 2 do you think you can influence as a general manager, the numerator or the denominator? And obviously they all concluded within seconds, the numerator, because the only thing they could influence was the net income. Then I brought up slide number 3, and it was all business jargon in Japanese. And they said, what on earth does that mean, Paul? I said, well, come with me. And I walked these general managers. We had 2 groups, one group on day 1, second group on day 2. And I walked them over to the window of this specific conference room that I'd asked for us to hold this meeting in. And we overlooked what is still there today, the Nomura Japanese bank. And I said to the general managers, if we don't get our capital employed above 7.2%, which is what it was at that particular point in time, if we don't get that above 12% within 2 years, we may as well all start learning Japanese, because Nomura are poised to purchase Hilton International. And I concluded the session by saying, well, what were those 3 numbers? They knew it was 7.2 present performance. We got to get it above 12%. How soon? Within 2 years. And we then spent the rest of the session brainstorming on best practices within the hotels about how we could get that return on capital employed above 12%. And even to this day, like 17 years later, I still have general managers say to me, I always remember the time that you presented that information to us. You saved us from 64 slides. You boiled it down to 3, and with a very, very clear call to action about how we can improve the return on capital employed. So that's the essence of the story. I wrap a few other things around that, but that was a useful little business finance story that I share.
Well, you also hit the pill in the peanut butter.
Yes.
The pill is data. The pill is, a lot of times people think that I'm saying, oh, tell a story, forget about the facts and the data and the statistics and the flow, forget all that stuff. Just tell stories about your daughter going to Disneyland. Tell stories about your vacation in Greece. It's like, no, you can hide the pill in the peanut butter. You can have the data, but the way that you slip it into the story as the narrative is moving forward allows it to get anchored. And the numbers get really anchored when you walk them to the window. Because I saw that. I saw that when you're telling that story. I'm seeing a whole room full of people, 15 people, get up and walk over to a window, and they're all like, what the hell are we doing? And I see that, I experience that. I feel like I'm one of those guys, and we're looking out the window, and it's like, because you've created this intrigue. The beauty is, I talk about intrigue a lot. It's like confuse your listener.
Yes.
Cause them to wonder, what the heck are you talking about? That will create engagement. 64 slides won't. But with that one trick, that third slide with Japanese, you absolutely confuse them. And you created intrigue. And I can just see you in that room knowing, I'm going to flip to the third slide. They're going to be triggered. And then I'm going to take them over to the window, and it's like slam dunk. This is visceral. Yeah. This is auditory, it's visual, it's kinesthetic, it's emotion, is a fast lane to the brain. Now they feel the pain. Oh my God, these numbers aren't just numbers. We got 2 years.
Yeah. Before I forget to mention it, Doug, I hope you don't mind me saying this, that I was reflecting this morning coming into the office. There's probably been 3 business books that have really been quantum leaps for me professionally. Number one, not in any particular order, but one of them would be The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I know you and I share.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Great praise in Stephen Covey's work.
Brilliant, just brilliant.
Another one for me was Built to Last by Jim Collins, which is his first book before Good to Great. And the third one, I'm not just saying this to be polite, was your book, Never Be Boring Again. And that book was just really profound for me, especially on the eve of starting a training and development company. And that was at the same time that I was still with Hilton. That book was a real kind of head bop for me.
That is the original version of what is now the Story Theater Method book. I reprinted it as the Story Theater Method. You also, when you're bringing on new people, you say you're looking for storytellers, you're looking for their ability to tell a story. Do you share with them the book or the 9 steps or the phrase that pays? Do you teach any of this stuff to them?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, if I was to show you, we have an operations manual, which we call Creating Raving Fans. And within that operations manual, we have an outline as to what we look for within keynote addresses, coaching assignments, seminars. And one of the things that we reference in there is the ability to tell and be able to share stories. And we actually have got listed in our operations manual a couple of resources, because we have a library at the office, which obviously people can just take things from the library, or they can buy their own and we'll just refund it for them. And one of those resources in there is the story theater work.
Good. That's fun, because people need help.
Yes.
Not everybody is a natural born storyteller.
Yes.
And a lot of natural born storytellers are not very strategic. They're just really comfortable telling stories, but they don't necessarily lead to an outcome that would drive business results. And your job, obviously, is to use a story to drive a business result, to get people to do something.
as I say, because I come from a big business background, I mean, the headlines are that I worked with PricewaterhouseCoopers out of university, and then McKinsey and Company out of London, and then Hilton. Because I come from a big business background, when we first moved to America, I knew from day number one, I wanted to create a business that could operate without me doing all of the delivery myself. And so I had to find people that I really believe could kind of move the hearts and minds of the clients that had engaged us to work with them. And again, people of very high character and very high competence that I could trust. And so I could focus on, what I believe that I could do best, which was to grow the business, build the client relationships, and then attract, retain, reward, high quality speakers. And resources like yours were and still are great kind of north compasses for me to help me select and again, engage and reward well, some really good young professionals.
Now, do you feel, and you've had enough years with your business to be able to gauge this, do you feel that storytelling affects your bottom line in a positive way?
Oh gosh, 100%. If you were to ask me, Doug, what do I think is one of the top 5 things that differentiates us from the majority of our competitors, one of those, without a shadow of a doubt, would be the ability to tell good stories. So without a shadow of a doubt, that has been massively beneficial to us in our business. You and I, I'm sure we've seen, and all of your listeners will have seen, mediocre trainers that have great content, that might be good on a flip chart, that might be good facilitators, but they don't move you to action. And again, I really, truly believe that one of those top aspects for us would be the ability to tell good stories. People, when we get rebooked for conferences and for seminars or for coaching assignments, people will often reflect upon, stories that Jim or Shannon or Charles or Mark or Bob from our team have told, or that I've told, if it's, say, a business finance piece, and they'll say, oh, we want you to come and do that with. So it almost becomes a calling card.
Well, one of the things that I've learned over the years, and I learned this very early on, is stories are products.
Yes.
People buy your story. They'll say, yes, we'd like you to come and speak at our conference, but you got to tell that story. What they're actually saying is, we're hiring you because of that story. And I assume you've got some other stuff that you're going to say, but we want to make sure you tell that story because we love that story.
You know what I always think about as well, Doug? I way in the past, I was an aspiring pop star as a kid. I wanted to be in a band. I was in a band, and I went on to manage a band and blah, blah, blah. And I see so many parallels between the music industry and obviously what we do. And you probably know where I'm going with this, is that, you think about Bon Jovi, do they really enjoy playing Living on a Prayer? But they know that is their, people are like, oh, we're going to book you, but you got to make sure you play Living on a Prayer. And I think about how some incredibly talented musicians, I think about Sting. I watched a documentary on Sting the other day. I mean, it's a beautiful song, but does he ever get fed up of playing Fields of Gold?
I don't get tired of listening to it.
And I'm sure he doesn't get tired of the money going into his bank account.
Well, but the thing about that as well is, I have learned to script and memorize and tell my stories with 95% accuracy each time.
Yes.
So if I tell the pill and the peanut butter story to you and you say, oh, that is spot on. That's exactly what my people need to hear. I want you to speak, at our upcoming conference in Surrey in April. And I want you to tell that story. You don't want some reasonable facsimile. You want what you heard. Just like when we go to a concert to hear Sting and we want Field of Gold, we don't want some weird version of it that we've never heard before. We want what we heard on the record. Give me the exact thing. Well, I believe our storytelling, if it's to be really effective, needs to be replicable. Not
Yes.
100% because we're not robots. But when you told the story to me just now from memory, sitting here spontaneously, did it pretty much come out of your mouth at least 90% the same as it always does?
Yes, I hadn't prepared for today to think in advance of that little story, but yeah, probably 90% of how I would tell it. And, to your point there, coming back to that music analogy as well, I've often thought about that. Why is it we want Sting to play Fields of Gold exactly as we remember it? And I think it's not only because we admire the song, same as say Living on a Prayer or whatever song, but I think it's because we see ourselves. Like, I remember I was at university, I was with that girl, I just had this challenge, my parents had gone through this. So it's a beautiful symmetry with storytelling. I always encourage our employees to, through the hills and valleys of life, just make notes of things. And I do exactly the same. And it's amazing how you can dip into those and you can see the principle, you can see the practice, you can see the application. So it's great to collect those little stories as you go along.
Well, I love that you use the word principles, because stories are best when they're teaching a principle.
Yes.
Honesty, courage, tenacity, teamwork.
Yes.
Embracing diversity. That's what stories do best. Stories don't teach you how to change a tire.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I found that
they're about broader principles, and we live and breathe and lead by principles, belief systems. And I literally believe, as a storyteller, you and I are philosophers.
Yes.
We're teaching a philosophy, a principle. And if we do it well, that sinks right into somebody's subconscious, into their heart and their soul. And that allows them to believe in that and then change their behavior.
Doug, that is so true, because as I mentioned in my introduction, we've been honored to work in, obviously, not only, I think it's 28 states now in the US, but also a couple of parts of China, India, 3 countries in Western Europe and Australia. And that whole thing about principles, because as you and I know, principles are just, universal. They apply to all, they're objective. And I've just found even the French, even the French, or most of the French. Let's just put the French in. No, I'm only kidding. I love the French. We've got the whole history there between the English and the French. But
yes,
I found that to be so true, that it doesn't matter where you are in the world, that if you can be teaching to a principle, preferably through stories, it's a game changer.
I actually had an experience once that blew me away. I've been telling my airport story, my look for the limo story, for years and years and years, hundreds and hundreds of times. And I got booked in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia.
Yes.
And this is a Muslim country. It's Muslim light. It's not like Saudi Arabia, but it's a Muslim country. And I had an opportunity to speak to a car company. And the entire population is Muslim. And I walked into this room, and there's going to be about 150 people for this keynote. And there's an aisle down the middle of the room. And on one side are the men. And on the other side are the women. Wow. Which immediately reminded me, oh, Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore. This is different. Well, I went into my presentation and I did what I do, and I taught what I teach, and I did it the same way as ever. And I did my airport story, my look for the limo story. And I had a question in the back of my mind going into this. It's like, this is a very different demographic. This is a very different room. I wonder if this will work. They laughed at the same places that any audience would laugh anywhere. Yes. They related to it the same way as any audience anywhere. And at the end of that presentation, people were coming up to me and saying, oh, that look for the limo, I really need to do that more. And they had the same relationship as somebody in Atlanta, or somebody in Los Angeles, or somebody in Denver or Boston. It's like, it's a universal way of communicating.
I'm a great believer that, that truth, as it were, is written on the human heart. And when we can stir something within someone, it doesn't matter where you are in the world or how old the person is, that truth will resonate with them. And I just found that to be so true.
And yet, what you said is where I'd like to end, which is just one of the most beautiful statements. You said, truth is written on the heart. And that is a perfect place for us to end this interview. So Paul Butler, I so thank you for your time and for reconnecting with me after all these years. It's been a lovely experience, and my listeners are going to gain a lot from this. Thank you.
And I wanted to say thank you to you, Doug, because quite genuinely, your work was a game changer for us and still is. I applaud you for what you've done and do.
Thank you. Thank you. Be well and carry on.
Thanks again, Doug.
Thanks. Bye-bye. All right, that's it for this episode. If you feel that you learned something valuable today, there are two things I'd like you to do. First, click on the follow or subscribe button. And second, share this podcast with 3 people. Forward it to them. Help me spread the word about storytelling that sticks. And if you're following me on LinkedIn, and I hope you are, please post a comment whenever I post a promo for a new episode of Storytelling That Sticks, and leave a review wherever you're listening to this podcast. And as always, I'd love to hear from you with your questions and comments. Let me know that you're out there listening and learning. And if you want help with your stories, speeches, or TED Talks, please get in touch with me. My email is doug@dougstevenson.com. Hey, thanks for listening. Until next episode, I'm Doug Stevenson.